Get up and do something. You just sit here all day? Useless. That was the voice of my daughter-in-law, Maria. I was sitting at the table, sipping my morning tea, when she burst in like a storm. I froze, staring at the steam rising from my cup, wishing it could hide me from the sting of her words. At 70 years old, after everything I had lived through, I never expected to be called useless in my own house. Behind her, leaning against the doorway, was my son Ambrose. He didn't even look at me. He kept his eyes on his phone, pretending not to hear, like he had trained himself to stay silent whenever Maria went off. That silence, it hurt more than her shouting. I wanted to answer. I wanted to tell her that this was my home, that I had earned every corner of it with sweat and sacrifice. But the words stuck in my throat, heavy as a stone. Maria's voice rose again, sharp as a knife. You expect us to do everything while you sit here? You don't even try? Paula. She spoke my name like it was dirt on her tongue. My hands shook around the handle of my mug, but I stayed quiet. It's a strange thing, being 70 and suddenly treated like a burden in the house you built. All those years of hard work, of raising a son, of paying bills and repairing walls, all erased with one word, useless. I looked at Ambrose again, hoping he might lift his head, say something, anything, but he slipped out of the room like a coward, leaving me alone under the weight of Maria's glare. She shook her head and muttered, pathetic, before slamming a cabinet shut and marching out. The walls of my kitchen rattled with her anger, then settled into a silence that felt heavier than the shouting. I sat there, staring at the faded tablecloth beneath my hands. That table had seen birthday cakes, Thanksgiving dinners, quiet breakfasts with my husband before he passed. It had held my family's laughter, my son's homework, even the bills I had worked extra shifts to pay off. Now it was where I sat like some invisible ghost, mocked in my own home. The hurt cut deep, not just because of Maria's words, but because my own son allowed it. Ambrose, the boy I raised, the one I sacrificed so much for, stood by and let his wife tear me down. He didn't defend me. He didn't remind her whose house this was. He just disappeared. I thought of the nights I'd stayed awake when Ambrose was sick, rocking him back to sleep. The mornings I left early for work, so he'd have lunch money. The years my husband and I skipped vacations, new clothes, even small pleasures, just so we could keep up with the mortgage. We gave everything to make sure Ambrose had a stable home. And here I was 70 years old, being told I was useless in that very home. The anger swirled with the sadness until something inside me hardened. I realized I had let their voices drown mine out for too long. I had let silence become my shield, but it was starting to feel more like a prison. That morning, sitting at that table, I made myself a promise. I might have stayed quiet in that moment. I might have let Maria think she had won. But deep down, I knew I wasn't finished yet. I had lived too many years, carried too many burdens, and fought through too many storms to let a woman like her define me. I took a long breath, straightened my shoulders, and whispered to myself so softly no one could hear, "This is still my house, and I am not done." Maria thought I was weak. She thought I would take her insults forever. She thought Ambrose's silence meant she had all the power. But she was wrong. Little did Maria know, the day was coming when I would shut her up for good. When Maria stormed out of that kitchen and left me sitting there with my cold tea, I found myself drifting back through the years. Sometimes when the present feels too heavy, your mind takes you back to where it all began. I was born and raised right here in Houston, Texas. My family never had much. My father worked at a plant, and my mother cleaned houses to keep food on the table. We lived small, but we lived honest. From a young age, I knew the value of hard work. I met my husband, Richard, when I was 20. He wasn't flashy or rich, but he was steady, kind. and he believed in building a life from the ground up. We married young, and before long, Ambrose was born. Back then, we didn't have much more than dreams, but Richard and I were determined. We worked day and night to buy a little brick house on the edge of the city. It wasn't much to others, but to us, it was everything. I still remember laying tile in the kitchen myself, scrubbing paint off my arms after painting the walls, and watching Richard dig in the yard to plant the pecan tree that still stands outside today. We skipped a lot to make those mortgage payments. No fancy dinners. No vacations to the beach. I wore the same winter coat for 10 years because we needed that money for Ambrose's school supplies. Richard often worked double shifts, and I took on sewing jobs at night just to make sure we never missed a payment. We said to each other, one day it will all be worth it. And it was. That house became our anchor, the one thing in this world that was truly ours. When Richard passed away 15 years ago, I thought I'd never breathe again. The silence in that house was unbearable at first. But after the shock, I found comfort in the home we built together. Every brick reminded me of our sacrifices, our laughter, and our love. My garden became my safe place. I planted roses by the front steps, kept tomatoes in the back, and watched the seasons come and go. That home gave me roots when I felt like I was drifting. For years after Richard's death, it was just me and that house. I cooked for myself, visited church on Sundays, and kept busy with neighbors. I wasn't lonely all the time, but I did miss having family close. Then Ambrose called one afternoon. He said, "Mom, we're having some trouble. Would it be okay if Maria and I stayed with you for a little while?" I didn't even hesitate. My son needed me, and the thought of having family in the house again warmed my heart. I told him, "Of course, Ambrose. This is your home too." They moved in a week later. I remember cooking a big pot of stew that first night, thinking it would feel like old times. I even set the table with the dishes Richard and I had saved up for. I thought it would be wonderful, laughter in the kitchen again, footsteps in the hallway, a little life back in these walls. But it didn't take long for me to realize things weren't the way I imagined. Maria was different. She walked into the house like it belonged to her. She criticized the way I kept things, rolled her eyes at my cooking, and treated me like I was an inconvenience in my own home. At first, I brushed it off. I told myself she was young, maybe just adjusting. I wanted to believe we could get along, that we could be family, and I kept telling myself it was temporary, just like Ambrose had said. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Then a year passed, and they were still here. Somewhere along the way, the respect disappeared. Maria acted like she was the head of the house, and Ambrose, well, he never stood up to her. I told myself not to complain. I told myself to be grateful they were here, that at least I wasn't alone anymore. But deep inside, all I wanted was simple. I didn't need riches. I didn't need to travel the world. All I wanted was to live out my days in the home Richard and I built with a little peace, a little respect, and maybe a laugh now and then. That was my dream. Nothing fancy, just peace. Instead, what I got was Maria's sharp tongue, Ambrose's silence, and the slow feeling that my home was no longer mine. That night, after Maria called me useless, I sat in my bedroom and stared at the framed photo of Richard on the nightstand. His smile looked so steady, so sure, just the way I remembered. I whispered, "Richard, I don't know what to do. They've turned our home upside down." I didn't hear an answer, of course, but staring at that picture reminded me of who I was, of the life I had lived, and of the promise I had made with my husband, that this house would always be our safe place. And I knew then that I couldn't let anyone, not even family, take that away from me. It didn't take long after that morning for Maria's words to turn into a daily routine. What she said in the kitchen that day was only the beginning. At first, it was little comments here and there. If I made breakfast, she'd glance at it and say, "Nobody eats food this heavy anymore." Or if I made a pot of beans and rice the way Richard used to love, she'd wrinkle her nose and ask, "Why don't you order something decent instead of wasting time on this?" One night, I spent the whole afternoon cooking stew, the kind Ambrose always asked for when he was a boy. I seasoned it just right and baked cornbread to go with it. I set it all out on the counter. But when Maria came into the kitchen, she lifted the pot, sniffed it, and dumped the whole thing into the trash. "This smells old-fashioned," she said, like she was doing me a favor. "Nobody's going to eat that." I stood there frozen, my hands still holding the ladle. That stew wasn't just food. It was memories, it was comfort, it was love served in a bowl. Watching her toss it out like garbage cut deep. Ambrose came in a few minutes later, saw the empty pot, and shrugged. "Let it go, Mom," he said quietly before following Maria into the living room. That became his line for everything. Just let it go, Mom. But letting it go started to feel like I was letting go of myself. Then she began changing things around the house. At first, I thought maybe she was just trying to make the space her own. But soon it was clear she wanted to erase me. I'd wake up to find furniture moved around. My favorite rocking chair that Richard bought me was shoved into the garage without anyone asking. A quilt I'd made years ago disappeared from the couch. When I asked where it went, Maria told me she donated it because it made the living room look cluttered. Even the photos on the wall weren't safe. I came home from the grocery store one day to see several of our family pictures replaced by framed prints she'd ordered online. When I asked about the missing pictures, she laughed and said, "I'll put them back when we remodel. Right now, this house needs an update." Remodel? It wasn't her house to remodel. But Ambrose stayed quiet, as always. The worst part came when guests were around. Maria had a way of turning me into the punchline. One evening, she invited a couple of her friends over. They sat in the living room drinking wine, laughing loudly. I stayed in the kitchen, minding my own business, but I could hear every word. Maria told them, "Paula can't really manage on her own anymore. That's why we had to move in. If we weren't here, I don't know what would happen to her." Her friends nodded sympathetically, glancing toward the kitchen as if I were some fragile old woman about to crumble to dust. I wanted to walk in and shout, "I've been managing fine for years. I pay the bills. I keep this house. I live my life just fine without you." But the words stayed stuck. I didn't want to cause a scene. So I stayed quiet, folding laundry with tears in my eyes. The humiliation piled up like dirty dishes no one wanted to wash. Every day it was something new. And every time I looked to Ambrose, hoping he'd put a stop to it, he'd just say, "Let it go, Mom." But I couldn't let it go anymore. It felt like I was disappearing, like my presence in my own home no longer mattered. One afternoon, as I passed by the hallway, I heard Maria on the phone. Her voice was low, almost a whisper, but the words froze me where I stood. She said, "We need to get the house signed over sooner than later. The way things are going, it shouldn't be hard." I pressed my back against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. Signed over? My house. The home Richard and I had spent our whole lives building. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened as she continued talking, laughing softly as though it were already a done deal. In that moment, I realized this wasn't just about disrespect anymore. This was about control, about power, about taking away the one thing in this world that still gave me comfort and dignity. And I knew then, deep down, that Maria had a plan to push me out of the very place I had sacrificed everything to build. That thought stayed with me long after she hung up the phone. And it was only the beginning of what I would discover. That night after hearing Maria on the phone, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about what she said, get the house signed over sooner than later. The thought made my stomach twist. That house wasn't just walls and a roof. It was my life, my history, my everything. I closed my eyes, and memories came flooding back. When Richard and I first bought this house, we barely had 2 nickels to rub together. It was a modest little brick place, nothing fancy, but to us, it was a castle. We signed those papers with shaky hands, terrified that we wouldn't be able to keep up with the payments. But we promised each other we'd do whatever it took. And we did. Richard worked extra shifts at the plant. Sometimes he'd come home, so tired his clothes smelled like smoke and sweat, but he'd still sit down at the table and ask me about my day. I picked up work wherever I could. Sewing, babysitting, even cleaning offices at night after Ambrose was asleep. We skipped dinners out, birthdays with presents, and Christmas trips. Every penny we saved went toward the house. I still remember the hardest year, when Ambrose was 12. Richard got hurt on the job and was out of work for months. The bills piled up, and I thought we might lose everything. That's when I opened the little jewelry box on my dresser and took out the locket my grandmother had given me when I was 16. It was gold, with her initials engraved on the back. I had always promised myself I'd pass it down to Ambrose's daughter someday. But that year, I walked into a pawn shop with shaking hands and slid it across the counter. The man gave me $200 for it. I remember crying on the bus ride home, clutching the cash, knowing it was the only way to keep the lights on. We pulled through. Richard healed, went back to work, and a year later, I marched back into that same pawn shop and bought the locket back. I swore I'd never let it go again. To this day, it sits in my dresser drawer. Every time I see it, I remember the price we paid to hold on to our home. That's what Maria doesn't understand. This house isn't just a piece of property. It isn't something you can sign over like it's a car title. Every brick, every nail, every corner of this place carries the weight of sacrifice, sweat, and love. Richard used to say, this house is more than a shelter. It's proof of what we can survive. And he was right. So when I heard Maria talking about getting it signed over, something inside me hardened. I promised myself right then and there I would never, ever let her take what Richard and I built. Not through lies, not through pressure, not through trickery. This was my home. It would stay my home until the day I died. The next morning, I woke up with a new determination. I went to the kitchen, made myself coffee, and sat at the table just thinking. For too long I had stayed quiet, letting Maria run her mouth, letting Ambrose hide behind his silence. But now I realized silence wasn't protecting me. It was giving them power. I thought about Richard. I thought about how he'd never let anyone walk over us. And I decided I needed to find my strength again. Later that afternoon, as I walked down the hall, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Maria was in my bedroom. My bedroom. The door was cracked open, and I saw her bent over my desk. She had pulled out the top drawer, the one where I keep important papers, insurance forms, the deed to the house, my will. She was rifling through it like it was hers. I stood there quietly, hidden by the doorframe, my heart racing. I wanted to shout, to snatch the papers out of her hands, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to know just how far she was willing to go. She picked up the folder with the deed, opened it, and scanned it like she was searching for something. Then she set it down, pulled out another envelope, and stuffed it back quickly when she heard footsteps in the hall. I backed away before she could see me. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was a plan, a scheme. And I knew one thing for certain. Maria wasn't going to stop until she got what she wanted. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. After I caught Maria snooping in my desk, I started paying closer attention. And the more I noticed, the worse things seemed to get. She wasn't hiding her disrespect anymore. She was bold about it, like she was daring me to object. One Saturday evening, Ambrose invited a few of his old friends over. They hadn't been to the house in years, and I was happy at first, thinking maybe I'd hear laughter and see him enjoying himself. I baked cookies that morning, just like I used to when he was in high school. I thought maybe it would bring back good memories. But when his friends arrived, I stayed mostly in the kitchen, giving them space. I heard them talking and laughing, catching up. That part warmed my heart. Then Maria's voice cut through, loud enough for everyone to hear. She said, "Honestly, Ambrose and I have our hands full taking care of Paula. She really can't manage on her own anymore. We're basically running the house for her." The room went quiet for a second, and then one of the men said softly, "Oh, wow. I didn't realize." I froze, standing in the kitchen doorway with a tray of cookies in my hands. My face burned with shame. She was making it sound like I was helpless, like I couldn't boil water without her. And Ambrose, he just sat there, staring at his drink, not saying a word in my defense. I set the cookies down on the counter and went to my room. I couldn't stand to face them after hearing that. The next morning, I went to fold laundry and noticed something missing from the couch. The quilt. My quilt. I had stitched it myself 30 years ago from scraps of Ambrose's baby clothes and pieces of old dresses. It wasn't just a blanket. It was memories sewn together, a reminder of the life we lived as a family. I searched the closets, the laundry basket, everywhere. Finally, I asked Maria if she'd seen it. She didn't even blink. She said, "Oh, that thing?" I tossed it in the donation bin. It was old and made the living room look outdated. I couldn't believe it. My throat tightened. That quilt was a piece of me, and she threw it away like trash. Later that week, Maria threw a small party for some of her coworkers. She had people over drinking wine, eating takeout, talking loudly in the living room. I kept to myself, but when it was over, she turned to me and said, "The kitchen's a mess, Paula. You can go ahead and clean it up." Just like that. Like I was her hired help. I looked over at Ambrose, who was already heading upstairs. He didn't even look back at me. So I stood at the sink, washing dishes while Maria laughed in the next room with her friends. My back ached, and my hands were pruned from the water, but I stayed quiet. That silence was starting to eat at me. Every day, I felt myself shrinking, like I was fading out of my own home. But then one night, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. I had gone to bed early, but their voices carried down the hall. Ambrose was talking to Maria in low tones. He said, "Maybe Mom should just sign something, to keep things organized. It might be easier in the long run." I sat up in bed, straining to hear. Maria's voice was softer, but I caught her answer. "Don't worry, I'm handling it. She won't even know what she's signing." I felt my heart thump, so hard it hurt. So that was their plan. They weren't just disrespecting me. They weren't just making me invisible. They wanted my signature on something important, something that could take away the house Richard and I had sacrificed for. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my chest tight. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just family tension. This wasn't just about harsh words or thoughtless behavior. This was about something bigger, something dangerous. And if I didn't find out what it was soon, I might lose everything. After hearing Ambrose suggest that I sign something, I couldn't rest. I kept wondering what he meant, what papers Maria might be pushing behind my back. For days, my mind spun with possibilities. I started paying closer attention, noticing little things I had overlooked before. Maria spent more and more time on her laptop at the dining table. She would close the screen quickly if I walked by. Sometimes she'd tilt the screen away or lower her voice on phone calls. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but my gut told me something wasn't right. One afternoon, she left in a hurry to meet a friend, and she forgot to shut the laptop. I went to grab a glass of water, and when I passed the table, the glow of the screen caught my eye. My hands trembled as I leaned closer. I knew I shouldn't look. It wasn't my business. But then again, it was my house. And if she was planning something involving me, I had a right to know. What I saw made my heart sink. There was a chat open, a message thread with her cousin. In one message, Maria had written, "Don't worry, I'll own the house soon. Ambrose is on board. She's too old to put up a fight." I read it twice, my stomach twisting into knots. Own the house. My house. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I scrolled up a little, and the messages were filled with her boasting about how Ambrose never questions her, about how she just has to get Paula to sign. I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I reached for my old flip phone. The camera wasn't great, but I managed to snap a few pictures of the screen. My breath caught in my throat. I felt like my world was tilting. Then my eyes drifted to a document sitting right beside the laptop on the table. It was a stack of papers, half covered by a folder. Curiosity pulled me in. I slid the folder aside, just enough to see the top sheet. It was a power of attorney form. My name was printed on it, half filled, with blank spaces waiting for signatures. My knees went weak. I pulled out a chair and sat down before I fell. I stared at the paper, the weight of it pressing down on me. Maria wasn't just talking big. She was making it real. The form looked like something she had downloaded, maybe even planned to sneak in front of me one day. If I had signed it without reading carefully, she would have gained control over my property, my finances, over everything. I quickly pulled out my phone again and snapped more pictures. My hands were clammy, and I could feel sweat rolling down my back. Then I heard the front door open. My chest tightened as Maria's footsteps echoed through the hallway. I stuffed the papers back under the folder, closed the laptop halfway, and hurried to the kitchen, pretending I had been tidying the counter. "Did you touch my computer?" she asked casually as she set her purse down. I forced a calm smile. "No, I've been in the kitchen." She narrowed her eyes for a second, then shrugged and walked off. I gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady my breath. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hands, scrolling through the blurry pictures I had taken. The words were clear enough. "I'll own the house soon." And the power of attorney form left no doubt. Tears slid down my face. I had raised Ambrose in this house. I had poured my life into making sure he had a stable place to grow. And now, the woman he chose as his wife was plotting to strip me of everything Richard and I had sacrificed for. But as the tears fell, something else stirred inside me. A fire. I wiped my cheeks with the back of my hand and whispered into the stillness of the room, "Not this time. You won't win." For the first time in years, I felt my silence breaking. I might have been 70. I might have been tired, but I wasn't helpless. And if Maria thought she could steal my life's work without a fight, she was about to learn how wrong she was. The night I discovered Maria's messages and the power of attorney form, I barely slept. I kept staring at my phone, the blurry photos glowing back at me, proof that she was planning to take everything Richard and I worked for. By morning, I knew I couldn't carry this alone. For years, I'd kept quiet, thinking silence would keep the peace. But silence wasn't protecting me anymore. It was destroying me. I needed someone I could trust, someone who would believe me, That's when I thought of Doris Lane, my neighbor 2 houses down. Doris and I had known each other for decades. She was in her late 70s, sharp as a tack, and had worked as a paralegal before retiring. We'd shared cups of coffee, swapped garden tips, and leaned on each other after our husbands passed. If there was one person I could turn to, it was her. That afternoon, I walked down the street and knocked on her door. She opened it with a warm smile, her silver hair tied back neatly. "Paula," she said, "you look like you've seen a ghost." I stepped inside, my hands trembling. "Doris, I need to talk to you. It's about Maria and Ambrose." She led me to her kitchen table, poured us both coffee, and said gently, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about Maria's insults, about Ambrose's silence, about the quilt, the meals, the humiliation. And finally, I told her about the messages on the laptop and the power of attorney form with my name on it. When I finished, Doris sat back, her eyes steady on mine. "Paula," she said firmly, "you have more power than you think, but you can't let this go on. We need to fight back smart." Her words sent a shiver through me. Fight back. I hadn't heard those words in so long. Doris leaned forward. "First, you need to protect yourself legally. Update your will. Make sure everything is crystal clear about who gets what and when. Don't leave any room for tricks. Second, you need to start documenting every insult, every threat, every time Maria tries to push you. Record it, write it down, save it. Evidence is your shield." I nodded slowly, feeling something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. "But Doris," I whispered, "what if Ambrose is part of this too? He's my son." Her eyes softened. "I know, Paula. That's the hardest part. But sometimes love blinds us to the truth. You can love him and still protect yourself. If he truly cares about you, he'll come around. If not, then at least you'll be safe." I sat there, clutching my coffee cup, letting her words sink in. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone. Doris reached over and patted my hand. "I know a lawyer, George Patel. We worked together years ago. He's honest and sharp, and he won't let anyone push you around. I'll set up an appointment." My heart pounded. This was really happening. I wasn't just sitting in silence anymore. I was taking a step forward. "Thank you, Doris," I whispered, tears filling my eyes. She gave me a firm nod. "Don't thank me yet. Thank yourself for finally standing up. You're stronger than you realize, Paula. You just need to remember it." When I left her house that day, the air felt lighter. The weight on my shoulders had eased just a little. I walked back to my home with a plan forming in my mind. That evening, when Maria snapped at me for folding laundry the wrong way, I quietly pulled out my old phone and pressed record. Her voice, sharp and nasty, filled the room. I saved the file and tucked the phone back into my pocket, my heart racing. It was a small step, but it was the beginning. As I lay in bed that night, I replayed Doris's words in my head. "You have more power than you think." For the first time in a long time, I believed her. And when she called me the next morning to say she'd set up an appointment with George for later that week, I felt a spark of strength I thought I'd lost forever. I whispered to myself, "It's time. No more silence. No more being invisible. If they want to fight, they'll get one." After Doris set up the meeting with her lawyer friend George, I knew it was time for me to stop hoping things would get better on their own. Hope without action wasn't going to save me. If Maria wanted a war, then I needed to be ready. The first step was evidence. Doris had told me to record everything, and I took that to heart. A few nights later, Maria caught me sitting in the living room watching one of my old shows. She crossed her arms and said, "You're nothing without us, Paula. This house should be ours already. Ambrose and I are the ones keeping things together, not you." Her words cut like a knife, but this time, instead of shrinking, I pressed the record button on my phone tucked in my sweater pocket. Her voice came through clear, every cruel syllable captured. I saved the file, labeling it Living Room, Thursday. I started doing that every chance I got. Whenever she belittled me, whenever she raised her voice, I quietly hit record. It felt strange at first, but with each file saved, I felt stronger. I wasn't just sitting there absorbing her abuse anymore. I was building a shield. The next step was protecting my papers. I couldn't risk Maria getting her hands on them again. One morning when the house was quiet, I gathered everything important. The deed, the insurance, my will, Richard's death certificate. I put them in a large manila envelope, slipped it into my old tote bag, and carried it down to Doris's house. She locked it away in her safe, giving me a small smile. "Now you can sleep easier," she said, and she was right. That night, I slept without waking every hour to check my desk drawer. Still, my nerves rattled as the day of my meeting with George approached. Doris came with me, sitting beside me in the lawyer's office as I laid everything out, the recordings, the pictures of Maria's messages, the snapshots of the power of attorney form. George adjusted his glasses, studying the papers carefully. Then he leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Klein, you were right to come. What Maria is attempting here is fraud. If she got you to sign this form under pressure or without full understanding, she could gain control of your assets. But you caught it in time. And with these photos and recordings, you have strong evidence." Hearing that word, fraud, made my skin prickle. It was worse than I thought. This wasn't just family drama. This was criminal. George gave me a reassuring nod. "Don't worry. We can stop this. First, we'll update your will to make sure everything is clear. Second, we'll draw up a statement that no power of attorney has ever been granted to Maria or Ambrose. Finally, keep recording. The more proof you have of her intentions, the stronger your case will be if she tries anything." I left the office that day feeling lighter than I had in weeks. There was a plan now, a real one. But Doris reminded me on the walk home, "Paula, don't show your hand too soon. Let Maria keep thinking you're just the quiet old woman in the corner. When the time comes, we'll pull the rug out from under her." So I did exactly that. I stayed polite. I stayed quiet. I kept playing the part of the helpless mother-in-law, the one Maria thought she could push around. But inside, I was sharper, more alert than ever. When Maria ordered me to wash the dishes after another one of her get-togethers, I nodded and rolled up my sleeves, all the while slipping my phone into my apron pocket to record her snide comments. When she tossed out another one of my belongings, a small framed picture of Richard from our early years, I bit back the sting and tucked away my anger, focusing only on capturing her words for my files. Each insult became fuel. Each recording became armor. And each night, I whispered to myself, "Not much longer." Then, just when I was starting to feel like I had regained some control, Maria dropped her latest bombshell. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was in the kitchen fixing myself tea when she walked in with that smug look on her face. Ambrose was right behind her, looking nervous, his hands shoved in his pockets. "Paula," Maria said, her tone dripping with fake sweetness, "we've decided it's time to sit down as a family and discuss your future." I froze, the spoon clinking against my mug. "My future?" I repeated slowly. "Yes," she said, smiling like she was doing me a favor. "We'll have a family meeting tonight after dinner. It's time to get some things in writing so everything is clear." I looked at Ambrose, hoping for some sign of hesitation, but he just stared at the floor. I stirred my tea calmly, though inside, my chest tightened. She thought she was finally about to corner me, but what Maria didn't know was that I had my own plan. And when that family meeting came, I wouldn't be the one caught off guard. The so-called family meeting was set for Sunday evening. I spent the whole day steadying my nerves. Doris reminded me, keep calm, keep your evidence ready, and let Maria dig her own hole. I held her words close like armor. By 6 o'clock, the living room was arranged like Maria wanted it. She and Ambrose sat together on the couch, her chin lifted, his shoulders slumped. To my surprise, Maria's parents were there too, Diane and Frank. They sat stiffly in armchairs, clearly invited as witnesses. Doris walked in beside me, her face calm but firm, and right behind her was George, the lawyer she'd brought along. Maria's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you all for being here," she said, like she was hosting some kind of ceremony. "We're here to talk about Paula's future. She's had trouble keeping up with things around the house, and we just want to make sure she's safe and secure." I stayed quiet, hands folded in my lap. She pulled a manila folder from the coffee table and slid out a stack of papers. "This is a simple agreement," she said smoothly. "All it does is transfer responsibility to me, and Ambrose, so bills and maintenance are handled. Nothing major, just for her safety." Ambrose glanced at me nervously, but said nothing. He couldn't even look me in the eye. I stared at those papers for a long moment. Then I slowly stood. My knees might have been old, but my voice came out steady. "Maria," I said, "you've had a lot to say about me lately. And tonight, I think it's time everyone hears the truth." She blinked, caught off guard. "Paula, let's not make this harder than it needs to be." I held up my hand, cutting her off. Then I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a small folder of my own. My phone was already set up. With one click, Maria's voice filled the room. "You're nothing without us. This house should be ours." The words rang out sharp and ugly. Maria's parents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Frank frowned, and Diane's lips pressed into a tight line. Maria's smile cracked. That was taken out of context. But I didn't let her finish. I pressed play again. "You can go ahead and clean it up. The kitchen's a mess." The recording of her bossy, dismissive tone hung heavy in the air. Then I pulled out the printed screenshots from her laptop messages. My hands no longer trembled as I read aloud. "Don't worry, I'll own the house soon. Ambrose is on board. She's too old to put up a fight." Gasps filled the room. Ambrose finally looked up, his face pale. "Maria, you said that?" Maria's cheeks turned bright red. "That's private. She had no right to." George, the lawyer, cleared his throat firmly. "Actually, Mrs. Klein had every right to protect herself. These messages and recordings clearly show intent to commit fraud. Any document you were about to present tonight is null and void. And if you had tricked her into signing, it would have been a criminal offense." "Silence." I looked straight at Maria. Then, my voice low but steady, "This house is mine, Richard, and I earned it with our sweat and sacrifice. We gave up vacations, we worked long nights, we pawned family heirlooms just to make the payments. No one, no matter how entitled or arrogant, will take that away from me." Doris smiled softly from her chair, pride shining in her eyes. Maria's parents stared at their daughter, with embarrassment written all over their faces. Diane shook her head. "Maria, how could you? After everything Paula has been through." Ambrose slumped back into the couch, unable to defend his wife this time. Maria's lips pressed into a thin line. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Then, with a sharp movement, she shoved the papers back into the folder and stood. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "I don't have to sit here and be attacked." She stormed toward the door, heels clacking against the hardwood, her parents trailing behind her in silence. Ambrose stayed seated, staring at his hands like a boy caught cheating on a test. The front door slammed shut, and the house went still. I looked around the room, then back at George. He nodded reassuringly. You're safe now, Mrs. Klein. With this evidence, Maria doesn't have a leg to stand on. Keep your papers locked away, and if she tries anything again, we'll handle it." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My hands loosened, the weight finally lifting. For the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again, steady, firm, unshaken. Turning to Ambrose, I said quietly, "Son, I love you, but you need to think hard about who you've been siding with." He didn't answer, but his face told me he finally understood the damage done. That night, as I walked Doris and George out, I felt stronger than I had in years. I had faced the storm, and I had not broken. Maria had tried to silence me, to steal everything I held dear. But in the end, I shut her up for good. After Maria stormed out of the house that night, the air finally felt lighter. I sat down slowly, my hands resting on my lap, and for the first time in a long time, I felt peace settling back into my home. Ambrose stayed seated on the couch, staring at the floor. The silence between us was heavy, but it wasn't the same silence I had lived with for months. This silence was waiting for words, real words. Finally, he looked up at me. His eyes were red, and his voice cracked as he said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I let the words hang in the air for a moment. I had waited so long to hear them. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "I should have defended you. I should have seen what she was doing. I thought keeping the peace was better, but all I did was hurt you. I was weak." I studied him carefully, my heart aching but also softening. "Ambrose," I said quietly, "I raised you to be stronger than this. I raised you to stand up for what's right. You let me down, but more importantly, you let yourself down." He nodded slowly. "I know, and I want to fix it. I want to earn back your trust." I leaned back in my chair, letting out a long breath. Forgiveness doesn't come easy, especially when it's your own child who failed you. But he was still my son, and I knew holding on to bitterness would only poison me. "I forgive you," I said, finally. His shoulders slumped with relief. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Things will be different from now on. There will be boundaries." He nodded quickly. "Anything you say, Mom." I looked him square in the eyes. "Maria is not welcome back in this house. Not now, not ever. I won't live under her roof of cruelty again." Ambrose swallowed hard. "I understand. I'll respect that." The words felt like a weight lifted. For months, I had been shrinking in my own home, but now I was standing tall again. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet, but I found comfort in the stillness. Doris came over often, bringing her sharp wit and warm presence. My church friends started calling again once they heard I was back at services. For the first time in a long time, I laughed at the little things. I tended my garden, pulling weeds with my hands in the dirt, and thought of Richard. I could almost hear him saying, "You did good, Paula. You stood your ground." One Sunday after service, a friend asked me, "How are you doing, Paula?" "Truly," I smiled, really smiled, and said, "Stronger than ever." Because it was true. I had walked through humiliation, betrayal, and fear, but I had come out standing with my dignity intact. And that's when it hit me. Dignity is worth more than silence. For too long, I thought staying quiet would keep the peace. But all it did was hand my power over to someone who didn't deserve it. I may be 70 years old, but my voice still matters. My choices still matter. My life still matters. Now, when I sit at my kitchen table with my tea, I don't feel small anymore. I feel steady. I feel like Paula Klein again. And that's why I want to leave you with this question. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you stay silent to keep the peace, or would you stand up like I finally did? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments. And if this story spoke to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps keep these stories alive, so more women like us know that no matter our age, our voice still matters. Lastly, don't forget to download this wonderful book called 38 Uplifting and Funny Short Stories for Seniors. Easy-to-read tales that bring laughter, memories, and mental stimulation. It's full of heartwarming, simple stories written to bring a smile, stir up memories, and remind us that joy doesn't fade with age. It grows stronger. You'll find it in the pinned comment below.